True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Gail Katz-Bierenbaum was the attractive young wife of an up-and-coming surgeon when she disappeared in July of 1985. Her husband, Dr. Robert Bierenbaum, was an overachiever with a very promising future. Charming but admittedly awkward, Bob was a surgical resident who spoke several languages, piloted his own plane, played guitar, and enjoyed gourmet cooking. They seemed like the perfect Manhattan couple. Trouble in the Bierenbaum marriage began before there was even a wedding. Bob was obsessive, possessive, and controlling. Gail had always been a free spirit, a creative but very intelligent person, but Gail was raised with the goal of marrying a doctor. Her mother believed her financial insecurity and tendency to move from one thing to another would be cured if she just became a doctor's wife. Before her disappearance, Gail and Bob were planning a divorce. Bob didn't want Gail to leave him, though. Gail had told a friend that she had proof that Bob was committing Medicaid fraud. She would threaten to expose him and get her freedom. Then Bob called Gail's mother, looking for her. When Gail's mother arrived at the Bierenbaum apartment, she found Gail's purse with her keys and her cigarettes still there. Bob said that Gail had left in a huff the day before after an argument, and he hadn't seen her since. His story just didn't ring true. At the Quiet End today, we're telling the story of a couple who seemed to have life all figured out, but the reality of their lives and Gail's death was far from ideal. Without a body, it would take years to put together what happened to Gail and to bring Bob Bierenbaum to trial. But did they get it right? So let's start out with the beer and we can talk about that.
We got a beer. We got a discussion. We're ready to go.
Okay.
So the beer I chose today is one called MC Squared, famous equation. It's brewed by Equilibrium Brewery in Middletown, New York. It's a double IPA, and I know I just did a DIPA last week, but I really like this one too. And it's fairly similar. It's a new style, fruity New England style IPA. So this one, MC Squared, is a hazy orange color. It has a big, huge white head with a ton of lacing. Very pretty looking beer. And the head sticks around for a long time. So you got this nice color beer with a white head on top, and the head persists the whole time you're drinking it.
Nothing like a persistent head, I always say.
I always say that too. So, and it has an aroma both of tropical fruit and citrus fruit.
Okay.
And a little bit of floral. Quit laughing at me. Then the taste follows the nose exactly. It's got some mango, some papaya, some pineapple, a little tangerine, and some grapefruit. But it's more like the grapefruit rind. It's got that kind of bittery grapefruit.
I love that.
It's a thick, creamy, juicy beer. I think you'd like it.
I think I will. Let's open it up and try it.
All right, pop that top.
All right, here we are at the Quiet End today. You want to start out the conversation?
Well, sure. Dr. Robert Bierenbaum was a mother's dream come true for Gail's mother. He was a brilliant, handsome doctor who came from a good family. There seemed to be nothing he couldn't accomplish. To Gail Katz's parents, Bob was the kind of guy who could turn their daughter's life around. Now, she did need a little turning around, at least according to her parents. She'd had some tough times.
She was flighty and had some difficulties, yes.
So Gail was born in Brooklyn in 1956. Her father was an advertising executive, while her mom was a stay-at-home mother with her and her sister. Gail was 9 when the family moved to New Jersey. She was a straight-A student, but like many young women, she struggled with low self-esteem and depression. Now, Gail's mom, Sylvia, blamed Gail's father for Gail's poor self-image. Sylvia said he didn't show her enough affection or acceptance. And he wasn't affectionate. He wasn't the kind of guy who told his children that he loved them. And he was quick to anger. He wasn't physically abusive, but he yelled and berated both his wife and his children.
Which can almost be worse or just as bad.
Just as bad, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not physical, but if all you're hearing is kind of a steady diet of you're no good,
Severely damaging.
It's going to wear on you.
Absolutely.
So some people close to the family thought that Sylvia seemed very flighty and high-strung, and Gail seemed to follow in her mother's footsteps in that regard. Now, Sylvia always seemed to be arguing with her daughters. Gail sometimes had arguments with her father that would end with neither speaking to the other for weeks, even though they ate at the same table, sat in the same room to watch TV, and would ride in the same car. Dad was unable to deal with the emotional swings of Gail's personality. Now, Sylvia, for her part, put all her energy into helping Gail because she was so needy.
Well, Gail was still an excellent student when she graduated high school in 1973. She went to the State University of New York at Albany following a boyfriend. But Gail dropped out when they broke up during her sophomore year in 1975. She lost interest in getting her education, and that's when they think she started using some drugs. This upset her mom and dad, Manny and Sylvia, who had many arguments on that subject. Sylvia, of course, wanted her daughter to finish school and to be able to make a living and take care of herself. But being a Jewish mom from the suburbs who had worked as a receptionist in a doctor's office, Sylvia had another typical ambition for her Gail. She wanted her to marry a doctor.
Yeah, let's play into the Jewish stereotype, right?
Yes.
Marry a doctor.
Right.
You'll be happy forever.
I think a lot of mothers say that, though. You don't have to be Jewish. A lot of mothers
No, but that's the stereotype.
It is. That's true.
Maybe doctor, lawyer, second place.
But sometimes stereotypes are there for a reason.
Okay.
Now, Gail moved to Manhattan and entered a dance program at New York University. And she was a natural dancer, but she lacked self-confidence and dedication. She didn't really stick to it. So again, she dropped out. Then she took a course in social work that she also dropped out of. Then she went back upstate. During that time period, she dated musicians and tried to become involved in music and choreography, but it didn't lead anywhere career-wise. Her sister Elaine, who occasionally visited her, thought that some of the musicians Gail dated were just crazy people. Elaine felt her sister was lost, and she was going nowhere, and really didn't know how to get anywhere. Now, Gail's family rejected her boyfriends as either too old, too young, or not Jewish. They referred to her choices as Gail's Reformation projects.
Yeah, now Elaine felt that her older sister found damaged men and tried to fix them. In 1976, Gail lived in Albany with a musician who performed in a local band. Gail made some efforts to choreograph his band's movements, and she wanted to dance with the band during performances, but that never worked out.
No, why would it? That's kind of a weird thing.
It is kind of a
Unless you're a backup singer
ambition.
or something, yeah. Although, I mean, bands do have dancers, but
Yeah,
not
but
generally till they're at big shows.
I'm picturing a kind of a small-town band.
Yeah.
The last thing they need is a dancer or somebody up there with a choreographic sense.
True. Different.
Gail became friends with another band member whose name was Amanda. She played synthesizer and guitar and wrote songs. Now, Amanda, who had been a model, was 5'11", very, very pretty. She and Gail talked about everything. Now, Gail was torn between yearning for a creative life and her need to make a living. She talked about fulfilling the goal she shared with her mother, and that is to marry a doctor.
Right, and actually her therapist was on board with this marry a doctor plan too. They all felt that Gail needed security and stability, and that way she wouldn't have to work odd jobs to pay the rent, she could go back to school, she could get her degree. So she's being encouraged by her therapist and her mother. That's powerful.
It is, although I'm thinking maybe the therapist was thinking more of finding someone with a dependable job and income and stuff, and not so much that it had to be a doctor.
Well, yes, but the doctor's just the pinnacle of that.
Well, of course we are.
So I just think that's a lot of pressure to have your therapist and your mom
Well, there's no question.
saying you should marry for security, regardless of who you're marrying.
Right.
So Gail was spending time with different artists, but at that same time, she was always looking around for her doctor. And that was her M.O. She would find a new guy before she broke up with the old one. She was very distrustful of men, but she also saw them as potential rescuers. She thought that they could save her life from a life of failure and get her into a life of accomplishment.
Yeah, but if you have that kind of a dichotomy in your viewpoint of men, you're not ever going to find someone.
Not someone appropriate.
No.
No. She was having trouble finding a calling in life, finding out what she wanted to do. She always seemed to be starting up new things and then dropping out, starting something else. She was very sad and depressed often. Now, one of her treatments when she felt depressed was to have a night out with her friends. So one night she went out with Amanda to a dance club in Albany, and Amanda was approached by a young medical student who she would end up marrying. And he went to school with Bob Bierenbaum. And that's how Gail would meet him. They would introduce Gail to him sometime later.
Right. Now we're getting into the fate. Right?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
They were meant to be.
Well, I don't know about that, but it did happen.
Now, Bob was born in Newark, New Jersey in July of 1955. He was the eldest son of internist Dr. Marvin Bierenbaum and his wife Nettie. One of little Bob's first words was plane, P-L-A-N-E. It was the beginning of his lifelong fascination with flying. Now, Bob grew up in West Orange, New Jersey, which is pretty much next door to Newark, right in that area. He was raised in a large white house in an upscale suburban neighborhood. Dad was a doctor. Mother worked in their husband's medical office. His intelligence showed at an early age. Bob excelled in the sciences. He took piano and guitar lessons. He loved science. His favorite toy was his ham radio. So we're setting up to be a pretty geeky guy, aren't we?
Yes, very advanced.
He used to talk to people all over the world on his ham radio while he was in grammar school. In 1962, when he was 7, he took a course in astronomy at the Hayden Planetarium in Manhattan with adults. By the time he was a teenager at West Orange High School, he was an honor student and scored 800s on his college boards, just like me.
Yeah? Is that what you did?
Not even close.
Okay.
Bob also loved sports, and he made the varsity cross-country team. He took judo lessons. Now, through the use of chokeholds, he learned how to render a person unconscious within seconds. Chokeholds, including the open-handed shimawaza move that jabbed at the neck, caused asphyxia by compressing the carotid artery that supplied blood to the brain. Other chokeholds, if prolonged, could even kill. The advantage of such moves was that they were much easier and faster than the hands around the throat approach. So he could simply put his hands on the person's shoulders and his thumbs on the neck over the carotids and apply pressure.
Like the Vulcan hold.
Yeah, that's what it was, right?
Kind of. Sounds like it.
So shoulders, thumbs into the neck, boom, you got the carotids.
With a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah. Well, as a teenager, he was following in his father's footsteps, planning to be a doctor. He had a photographic memory, and he knew he could accomplish almost anything if he just went by the book. But unfortunately, Bob didn't read any books on personal relationships or how to deal with people or interact socially. So he was lacking there. He began college at Rensselaer Polytech in Troy, New York in 1972 when he was just 17. Then he went on to study medicine at Albany Medical College and graduated from med school when he was only 22.
Yeah, so he did college and med school in 5 years.
Right. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not easy.
That's an 8-year curriculum.
Yes.
Right?
Which is tough for most people to do it in 8 years.
I would say so.
Yes.
So he did it in 5.
Yes.
And at the same time, he also got a pilot's license.
He did.
So this is a driven guy.
Super overachiever, very proud parents. But what the parents did notice is that this accelerated education had deprived him of the normal social development he may have gotten if he'd stayed back with kids his own age. And one thing about Bob's personality is he was brutally honest, and he could hurt people's feelings, and he didn't even seem to know he was doing it. So Marvin and Nettie blamed themselves for allowing him to rely too much on his brain and to grow up too fast. It made him kind of an oddball. But still, they're proud. I mean, he's accomplished a lot.
Yeah, in just a few short years.
Yeah. Now, he really loved flying. It was actually more than a hobby to him. He wanted to be the first Jewish astronaut. And he applied to NASA when he got out of med school, but he got turned down. Then he briefly studied space medicine at the Johnson Space Center in Texas, where they advised him to serve a residency in internal medicine because it would give him a better chance at getting on the shuttle. So Bob went and fulfilled that residency, but NASA again turned him down without saying why. So this was one of the very few things in life at which Bob didn't succeed.
Very few things.
So I wonder why they turned him down. Do they do a psychological evaluation? Could that have been it?
Well, sure they do a psychological evaluation.
Okay.
Because you're going to be up flying in space.
Yes.
You need to be stable.
So I'm thinking that's why he was turned down, although I have nothing factual to base that on.
Well, I mean, the only thing we have is hindsight. And seeing how things turned out for Bob, you can surmise that one of the reasons, if not the reason, for him being turned down for the space program was that he was psychologically unfit.
Well, yes, because he was physically fit, and he seems like he was brilliant.
He certainly had the knowledge.
So I can't see any other reason.
No.
No.
So before Gail was introduced to Bob, she had attempted suicide twice, once by cutting her wrists and once by overdosing on barbiturates. She was in and out of psychiatric hospitals and continued to have outpatient therapy.
And I think that's something she continued all through her life.
Her short life.
Yes.
Now, Bob, by this time, was a resident in Manhattan. He was studying cardiothoracic surgery when he met Gail. He was athletic, with a handsome face, and was also a genius. Perfect musical pitch, and he was a pilot. So, my God, grab him.
He's checking the boxes, you know.
He came from a good family who lived only a few miles away in West Orange.
He's a catch.
And he is Jewish.
Right.
So, let's go.
He was everything Sylvia could want for her daughter.
Now, he was having dinner with Amanda, remember her, and her husband, who was a good friend of Bob's. And Bob said to them he was in between girlfriends and was a bit lonely in the city. Now, Bob told him what kind of girl he was looking for. Someone who's pretty, bright, and interesting. Well, don't we all want that?
Sure.
Bob wanted what his friend had, a beautiful, charming wife who made him happy. So Gail was pretty, bright, and interesting. While Bob was brilliant, outgoing, and accomplished, Gail was introspective and rather lost. At the same time, they were both lonely. They both lived in Manhattan. Maybe opposites would attract.
Yeah, so Amanda fixed them up, basically.
She did. She's the matchmaker.
Well, Bob took Gail up in his plane over Manhattan on one of their first dates, and she fell for him quite quickly.
Well, wouldn't you? I mean, can you imagine that first date?
I can't, really.
In the book, the way they described it, it was night, and they're flying up the East River between the buildings and stuff, and it must have been magical.
Yeah, how could you not be impressed with that?
No kidding.
So she went around telling her family and friends that Bob was taking away all of her problems and depression. So there's a red flag to me. You can't have another person cure your problems and depression, no matter how great they are.
No, they might help see you through it.
Sure.
But they're not going to cure it.
No, but she thought this was the cure. And she said she loved him, and they began to do these outdoor activities together, which were good because normally she wasn't doing that kind of stuff. They were hiking and biking and skiing, and it seemed like she was getting healthier. So they're a good-looking young couple, look happy together. And Gail had been working at an entry-level job at a Manhattan ad agency. So she was able to get free a lot to spend time with him. They became close quickly, even though they were different people. Kind of surprising people how fast it all happened, because they really had very little in common. And if you get down to it and really take a look at them, what do they have in common?
Sex.
Yeah.
That's about it.
That's about it. Bob was the first conservative Republican Gail had ever dated, so they disagreed on almost all political issues. And he was a dog person. She was a cat person. After they began dating exclusively, with Gail spending most of her time at Bob's place, some problems surfaced, of course. Bob had trouble with the idea of marrying someone who was a college dropout, working in a non-professional job. He wanted Gail to go back to school and get her degree. Now he noticed her suicide scars from cutting her wrists, and eventually she told him how she got them. Now this concerned him also, but he was already all taken with her and in love with her, so he wasn't going to get out of the relationship. So as these differences became known to one another, they did begin to have some fights. Bob worked about 120 hours a week in a cardiovascular surgery program, so he was under a lot of stress.
Yeah, and back in those days, that's a typical work week for these guys.
That's crazy.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
They don't do that anymore.
That's good.
But that's how those crazy bastards did it.
Right. Well, because they thought if you could make it through, you could do anything.
Right.
They were getting rid of the weak people.
That's what they did.
Bob's parents met Gail and they liked her, but they did think she was very high-strung. And they asked Bob not to rush into anything, but he's in love, he's young, he didn't listen.
No, he didn't. Now, Bob was intellectually based. Gail was emotionally based. But whatever his criticisms of Gail were, he was still obviously infatuated with her. He looked at her with a big grin on his face all the time. He seemed to be totally in love with Gail, and Gail seemed determined to find security. Not necessarily love.
No, and she did seem to have some serious doubts about her feelings for Bob, but was trying to make it work anyway. She actually listed some changes she wanted to make in Bob early on. And meanwhile, Bob was busy wanting to change Gail to fit what he wanted. And Gail resented Bob's efforts to change and improve her. Now, the biggest issue between the two was Gail's smoking. Bob didn't smoke, and he detested being around those who did. To him, it was just an irrational, unhealthy, disgusting thing to do. And he warned Gail about lung cancer and heart disease, and actually wrinkles, because he thought that might upset her more than heart disease is getting wrinkly.
Well, that's a good ploy, because I think that would have worked.
Yeah, but it just became a bone of contention.
Oh, no question.
It was something they would fight about a lot.
So Gail's mother and Gail's therapist were equally thrilled when she got engaged to Bob. Gail would marry a doctor, get a degree, and live a life of luxury. Well, sure.
Sounds like a plan.
Good plan. She could return to school, complete her degree, without ever having to work. Also, if she married Bob, Gail knew she would make him and her parents happy. So it seemed like a safe choice. It was a shortcut to end her pain. Gail had bad taste in men, being attracted to bad boys, controlling abusive types who might mistreat her. But with Bob, Gail was finally back in the good graces of her mother and father. They were very happy at the approaching wedding of their wayward daughter to someone who seemed like a Prince Charming. But you scratch beneath the surface.
Well, these always seem like they're just too good to be true, right?
And they are.
Yeah. I mean, actually, it was to the point where her parents seemed more happy about her becoming Mrs. Dr. Robert Bierenbaum than she was.
There's no question about that.
I mean, Sylvia was relieved and felt like Gail was finally on the right track. Bob was a doctor, he was nice looking, they were both Jewish, he came from that great family, and he wanted to get married and have a family. So this was the way for Gail to get a hold of her life and to have some direction. And Bob seemed to want many of the same things for Gail that her parents did. He wanted her to settle down, to go back to school, to get a degree, to have some kids. And he also insisted that she stop smoking. So he was kind of fixing her, making her into what he and her parents thought she should be, but that doesn't work.
Well, in this whole smoking issue, I mean, I can certainly see that as a cardiothoracic surgeon. He can see the effects of tobacco on people.
Right, right.
But it seems a little over the top.
It was over the top, and I strongly believe that if you're going to marry someone, you have to accept them as they are. You can't say, well, I'm going to change this and that. That's just a recipe for disaster.
It's never going to end happily.
No, you have to accept the things that you see as flaws and love them anyway. Otherwise, forget it. Forget about it.
Forget about it.
Won't work, right.
Now, Sylvia, Mom, couldn't resist bragging. My daughter Gail is marrying a doctor. He's a surgeon. He's Jewish. He's a skier. And so good looking. He even flies a plane.
Your New York accent could be offensive.
I grew up with that.
Oh, okay. So you can do it because you're from that area. Okay.
I'm from Jersey.
You're from Jersey. You're a Jersey boy. Well, months before Gail and Bob's wedding, Gail was very upset about a story that Bob had told her. Bob said he was taking his ex-fiancée Marcy's belongings back to her apartment, and that included Marcy's cat. And during the car trip, the cat was agitated and began jumping around inside of the car, making it dangerous for him to drive. So Bob drove with one hand on the wheel and grabbed the cat with the other. He said that in the struggle, his hand ended up around the cat's neck. Because the cat was endangering the vehicle, he said, he held it tight, and he accidentally strangled it to death. Bob expressed some remorse over the death, but Gail didn't believe him. She believed that Bob coldly, intentionally killed Marcy's cat. Now, a wild cat in the car really isn't going to crash the car. Unless it's totally
not.
wild.
Although, I mean, it could be a distraction.
You could pull over.
You could easily do that, right?
Yeah, I don't think you need to strangle it.
Well, he did.
He did, which is not good. She thought he did it to get revenge on the ex-girlfriend.
Yeah, now at the same time, Gail was afraid that Bob might hurt her own cat.
That makes sense.
It would. Bob thought that she loved her cat more than him. Her cat acted strange around Bob and would run away from him or avoid him. So Gail thought Bob was a little bit on the sick spectrum of things.
That's a nice way to put it.
But she had no intention of canceling the wedding. Well, of course not. How am I going to disappoint my parents?
Right. It's very irrational, but that's the way she was thinking. One August night in 1982, 3 weeks before the wedding, Bob and Gail decided to stop in Chinatown for something to eat. Gail thought that Bob was driving like a lunatic, and when they began to argue about where they would park, the fight was getting pretty nasty. So Bob ended up not even parking the car. He drove them home, and they weren't talking to each other. So they went to bed angry, each facing away from each other. And Amelia, Gail's cat, jumped up on the bed and curled up with Gail. Gail would tell her sister that Bob tried to strangle the cat in the toilet bowl that night. He had the cat's head under water, and he had his fingers around the cat's throat. He was jealous of her loving the cat, Gail said, and he wanted her full and undivided attention. Gail called Elaine the next morning and asked her to help her take the cat to a shelter because she's worried about the cat getting killed by her fiancé. But she made this comment, which I thought was very interesting. Bob looks good on paper, she said, until you meet him. That's when you see he's a social moron.
Yeah, in the book, they spend a lot of time, and several times, talking about his eyes.
Yeah, what about that?
How piercing they were. And just stared right through you as a measure of his social ineptness.
So do you think that means anything, or do you think that's just the way he looked?
Well, I think that's probably the way he looked.
Right.
And I think the author of the book is using that to her benefit.
Right.
Right?
For drama.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he did have kind of creepy eyes.
Yeah. And we know, not just because of his eyes, but there are numerous instances in the book demonstrating how socially unfit he was.
Yeah, that's true. But still, Gail had no plans to cancel that wedding.
No, sir. No, ma'am.
No.
No. Elaine decided that she disagreed with Gail, her therapist, and their parents. Gail didn't need a husband. She needed self-respect, motivation, ambition, and direction. Now, this would come from herself and from the right therapist, not from a husband.
So I agree with that. I think her therapist was out of line there.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Elaine sounds like a reasonable person. And I like her next comment. Why don't we keep the cat and get rid of Bob? She said.
Right,
There's
that's
something
great.
really wrong here, and this is really scary.
So she has common sense. I like Elaine.
She has single-minded sense,
Yes.
as we'll find out.
Right, but Gail just said she really felt she had no life to go back to. She had no choice but to marry Bob. She didn't want to be single, and she had this plan. All she had to do, she said, was make Bob happy and content no matter what it took. And then she would change him and everything would be great. Later, Gail told an older friend about this incident with the cat, and the woman tried to shock Gail into reevaluating her life decisions. And she said, "Why are you always putting yourself in situations that will blow up in your face, Gail? Why are you putting yourself in the position of the cat?" So I love that remark.
Putting yourself in the position of the cat means that you're going to be second fiddle.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a victim.
Right.
Yeah. But I think it's a great remark. It shows a lot of insight. I don't know who this woman was, but...
Yeah, we don't ever know.
No. But now's probably as good a time as any to take a little pause and talk about our sponsors.
Let's do that.
Okay.
So support for today's show comes from Grove Collaborative. Grove makes it easy to discover effective and natural home and personal care products. They select only the best, non-toxic products so you can shop with confidence, knowing that everything on their site is good for you, your family, and the planet.
Well, I really like how Grove offers us products that we do love to use without having to make any commitments. Plus, they give us price matching, free shipping, and the 100% happiness guarantee. Our home smells fresh and clean, and there aren't the harsh chemicals. And I feel really good about the products I have in my cabinets now, like I almost want to just leave the cabinet doors open when people come over because I'm so proud, like, look what I'm doing. So with their own safe, effective, and affordable flagship products as well, and the amazing brands like Method, Tom's, 7th Generation, Real Simple, Grove distributes these premium products that are natural, beautiful, and sustainable.
We've been switching over to non-toxic, earth-friendly products, both in our home and in my pediatric practice. Grove helps us meet our goals for safe and earth-friendly choices.
Everything's clean and smells fresh, but you don't get that hospital sterile smell. We've been using Mrs. Meyer's hand soap and Method glass cleaner, and now with Grove we're using that multi-surface cleaning spray, which not only works well, but it smells really fresh. It smells nice. Grove guides are always available to answer our questions, and Grove lets you set a schedule for things that you use all the time so you don't run out. True Crime Brewery listeners are getting a unique offer now and a bonus gift. Go to grove.co/brewery, and you'll receive a $30 Mrs. Meyer's gift set, plus a bonus gift, and a 2-month VIP membership for free with your order of just $20 or more. That's grove.co, not grove.com/brewery.
Grove makes it easy to have a happy and healthy home.
And this episode is also brought to you by the upcoming Starz original series, Wrong Man. Dick, do you know that 4% of all defendants that are sentenced to death are later proven to be innocent? Just imagine serving 20 years in prison, all the while knowing you didn't commit the crime that you're being punished for. And surprisingly, shockingly, it happens all the time in this country.
If you're a fan of True Crime Brewery and other true crime podcasts, you're going to get hooked on the upcoming Starz original series, Wrong Man, from the Emmy-winning filmmaker of Paradise Lost, Joe Berlinger. This new docuseries follows the stories of 3 inmates who have maintained their innocence for over 2 decades. Now these 3 men have one last chance at freedom.
This is really fascinating stuff to watch. There are 6 episodes, and they are really riveting. This sort of thing just sucks me in to the point where I forget where I am, and I become completely engrossed in the investigation and the legal efforts. In Wrong Man, highly esteemed legal and investigative experts dig relentlessly into each case to find the truth. It really is fascinating. Don't miss the series premiere of Wrong Man. It's on Sunday, June 3rd at 9 p.m. only on Starz. You can get the Starz app and start a free trial today.
Gail and her mom, Sylvia, had planned a perfect wedding. White, blue, and purple were the colors. But the day of the wedding did not begin well. Gail and her sister got into a screaming match with each other right before they got into their limo. Bob and Gail were married in the summer of 1982 on a sunny, perfect day. Gail was a beautiful bride in a traditional white, lacy wedding gown that had belonged to her mother-in-law. She wore a strand of white pearls, a crown of baby's breath, and a veil on her head. Bob was also dressed in white.
That's what they did in the 80s.
I guess.
My sister was married in the 80s, and that was the thing. She had a big fancy wedding in white. I think the groom was in white, if I remember correctly. It was a nice day for a white wedding.
So they honeymooned in Crete, where they stayed in a beautiful villa that belonged to one of Bob's doctor friends. Like many young couples, Bob and Gail had spats on their honeymoon. Really? Many couples fight on their honeymoon?
Many couples do. Not unusual.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Once, while sightseeing on a cliff overlooking the sea, Gail backed away from the brink because she had a sudden giddy terror that Bob might shove her over. Wow.
Okay, so you might say that this is a bad sign of the relationship?
I would.
I don't think so. I'm always afraid that someone's going to kill me. If I'm close to an edge, if someone has a chainsaw, it's just like a paranoid thing that some people have.
So you think it's just some irrational fear?
Yeah. Well, especially if you're afraid of heights like I am. Anytime I'm near a cliff or a ledge, I would say, holy shit, someone's going to push me. It wouldn't matter who. Just that whole fear. It's irrational. So, I mean, it could be a sign that she doesn't trust him, or it could just be who she was. A little bit weird like me.
Neurotic.
A little neurotic. Maybe that's what we are.
Can I say that?
She might have been a little neurotic. I don't know. Do they use that word anymore?
Yeah, I don't know.
She probably had some anxiety.
Okay.
I think that's what you'd say.
Let's stay there.
Okay.
So after the honeymoon, Gail went back to school, and Bob returned to his long hours at the hospital. Just a month before the wedding, Bob had begun his fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery. So this is a long slog. He's done a residency, which in surgery is like 5 years. And then you got another couple years of fellowship to be a cardiothoracic surgeon. Now the reward is that you're a big shot surgeon.
Yes.
So you're going to be making the bucks.
Well, yes, and you're going to be looked up to, which is almost as important as the money, if not more important.
Yeah.
You're going to be respected.
I mean, you're going to be looked up to more than just a general surgeon, for certain. So in addition, Bob also worked with his father Marvin at the World Trade Center and at 26 Federal Plaza, where they reviewed medical charts of Social Security claimants looking for fraudulent filings. Now, Bob pampered Gail. Though she seemed to enjoy the constant attention, she also at the same time began to feel suffocated by it.
So I'm not sure how that worked, because he was constantly working, it seems like. So how did she feel suffocated? It seems like she vacillated between feeling neglected and suffocated.
He was never around. I mean, he's
and
working.
when he was suffocating her, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say bad things about the victim here, but I think she was tough to make happy. She was relying on him to make her happy, which is a mistake to begin with.
Yes.
And it was impossible to do.
And you're not going to succeed in that.
No. So Bob was also studying to be a flight instructor, and his goal was to log as many hours in the air as he could, so he couldn't have been at home much. He did continue to fly on the weekends with Gail, and Gail was seeing a psychiatrist twice a week during that time. If she became extremely anxious, she would arrange for even a third session in a week.
Now, this is pretty intense psychotherapy.
It's a lot of therapy.
I mean, typically you're going to meet once a week, once every couple weeks. She's 2 to 3 times per week.
Yeah, and after they got married, the subject that dominated each session was Bob. Over and over, she discussed her fear of staying with Bob and her fear of leaving Bob.
Yeah, and this started out pretty soon after they were married. I mean,
yes.
It's not like there was a period of time when they seemed happy.
Not really. I mean, it quickly grew into this chronic fear of making him angry. So she became afraid of him pretty early on. Although he seemed distant in a way. So it's a very strange relationship.
It is. Now, what Bob would do to unwind after a day working was to do a flight simulator program on his Atari home computer. So even when he was home, he might not be interacting with his wife. He's busy flying a virtual airplane.
Right. But Gail was applying herself at Hunter College, and she had a 4.0 grade average. She seemed to have motivation and ambition for the first time in a lot of years. And Bob liked that. He also liked her to be thin, to work hard, and not to smoke. And for a while, she was doing it all for him. But of course, that's not going to last if you're doing it for someone else. And sometimes she felt like Bob really wanted her to be perfect, like he was. And she couldn't live up to that.
No, this is a lot of hard work, being perfect. So Gail's always on a diet. At college, she had made several new friends, and one of the girlfriends that she met, she talked about Bob and how much she wanted financial independence from him. And whenever Gail had a fight with Bob, she would ask this person or other people for advice. But the strange thing, or maybe not the strange thing, she never seemed to act on any of the suggestions. So one interesting thing that came about with this was that Bob was very possessive and had threatened to strangle her if she ever left him. Now, after watching a TV movie about the socialite Klaus von Bülow, who was charged with trying to kill his wife, Gail said Bob told her he would not leave a body to connect him to the crime. He said, the problem with the von Bülow case is that he left evidence. I would not leave evidence. Prophetic words, perhaps.
Yes, but haven't we all made comments like that? Doesn't make us killers.
I haven't made comments like that.
No?
No.
Not even sarcastically or jokingly? Sure.
No.
I think most people, at least with a dark sense of humor, make jokes like that. Gail studied different methods of psychotherapy. She was really into that. And then she got into this controversial confrontational approach called STAP, short for short-term anxiety-provoking psychotherapy. The goal was not to avoid anxiety, but to provoke it, in order to more quickly get to the base of a person's problems. One of the most debated features of this therapy was the focus on submerged murderous thoughts. Encouraging a patient to express homicidal fantasies could liberate repressed anger and clear up relationships, the therapists who taught this type of therapy thought. And Gail became involved with a project that had begun to evaluate STAP therapy by watching videotapes of sessions. One of the people Gail met in her clinical work was a young male physician, and Gail flirted with him, and this is when she began her first affair. She said that Bob, a staunch supporter of Israel, would be especially jealous if he knew her lover was of Arabic descent. Gail seemed pleased when she described how hurt Bob would be if he found out about this.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
Well, I think that's easy.
Yeah?
Yeah, she's pushing the buttons on Bob.
Right.
Knowing how pro-Israel he was, flaunting an Arabic lover on him would definitely get a response.
And we're going to get into this because we're not going to blame the victim. But there was a relationship there that was toxic.
It certainly was.
Yes.
Now, Bob and Gail's neighbors in the apartments on either side of theirs often heard Gail's taunting voice screaming at Bob, goading him. Sunday mornings seemed to be their favorite time. Now, like many couples, Gail and Bob fought over money. Gail was not able to live a life like a doctor's wife because Bob made no more than $35,000 a year as a surgical resident. Now, that's going to change, but he's got a couple more years before the big bucks start rolling in.
She didn't seem to have patience for that at all.
No.
No.
They would not have been able to live in their nice apartment without the generous help of Bob's dad. So when Bob returned from a long day and night at work, he began to get impatient with what he considered Gail's self-centered demands. The neighbors couldn't hear it, but Gail would sometimes become so enraged at Bob that she hit him. Now, he did not physically strike back, keeping his own rage bottled up. Sometimes one or the other would storm out of the apartment, slamming the door. But the end result was that they always were drawn back together. Bob was in love, couldn't imagine Gail leaving him. Gail imagined leaving Bob, but had nowhere else to go. Arguments had become chronic, with Gail demanding attention that Bob had no time and probably no desire to give.
Well, Bob felt she wanted him to be someone he wasn't, he would say. He felt that he worked very hard, yet she was never satisfied. So each of them in this relationship are probably feeling unloved and unsatisfied. And during one argument, Bob did lose his composure. Gail was angry that Bob refused to attend a party she wanted to go to, and he grabbed a large shiny knife from the kitchen and held it against his stomach. Now eventually he put it down, but he had threatened to hurt himself. And it seems like their arguments around that time had crossed this line from just shouting to this violent, histrionic acting out. During another shouting match in the car while Gail was driving, Bob flung open the car door and threatened to jump out into traffic. So Gail had stopped talking about her doctor husband once they were married, as if she just kind of filed that whole situation away, but she would talk about her boyfriends. She described pretty graphically, without being asked, what she did with these other men and how exciting it was. Then she would add, like kind of as an afterthought, that she felt bad about lying to Bob.
Yeah. Now, there's an important date coming up here, November 8th, 1983. Gail was up late studying for her graduate record exam, the GRE. Around 11 o'clock at night, she decided she needed to smoke to lessen her tension and took a pack of cigarettes and a lighter out to the terrace and placed them on the table between two chairs. She hadn't heard the apartment door opening behind her or seeing Bob standing in the doorway. Bob, though, when he saw the pack of cigarettes sitting on the terrace table, became enraged. Because as we know, he thought smoking was the devil's work.
Well, and I think this had just become a hot button between the two of them.
Oh, it had taken on a much greater meaning between them.
Than what it really was.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was all the things they didn't like about each other. All the things they fought about. So Bob scooped up the cigarette pack, tossing it over the balcony railing. So after tossing the pack of cigarettes over the balcony railing, Bob suddenly jumped over the terrace rail onto the other side. Nothing was keeping him from falling 12 stories except that his hands and feet were holding onto the railing.
Now this would freak me out completely.
Oh, well, you like heights anyway, right?
Right, that would just freak
and
me
you
out.
got this idiot who's on the other side, barely holding on.
No, that would be scary.
So Bob says it's all over. Now, Gail was stunned. She felt that Bob had tried to manipulate her with dramatic threats before, but this seemed real.
That is pretty real.
After his gesture had its desired effect on Gail, Bob climbed back and sat down at the table. "Why did you do that?" she demanded. Then Gail began to berate Bob and list all the things he did that she didn't like. She'd criticized his driving, told him that he was a pathological liar. So Bob stared at her and said in a very calm voice, "I'm going to kill you." So his hands jammed into the base of her neck, his thumbs apart, the old judo chokehold he had learned as a kid. The sides of Bob's hands jabbed painfully into both sides of Gail's neck at the same time, compressing the carotid artery on either side, which interrupted the flow of blood to Gail's brain. So deprived of oxygen-rich blood, she passed out and fell to the floor like a limp rag.
Well, she did wake up several minutes later with Bob hovering over her and apologizing, and he promised he would never do it again. And she didn't call 911, nor did she call anyone in her family. She took her test the next morning and actually did well, wearing a high collar to cover the bruises on her neck. But when she got home from school about 5 o'clock that evening, she called her older cousin, Hillard Weiss, who was a legal aid lawyer in Manhattan. Gail, who sounded extremely upset, told her about the fight with Bob and his assault on her. "What should I do? Should I leave? What would happen to me if I pick up and walk out?" she asked. "Would I lose rights to matrimonial property?" So she's still worried about possessions, which is crazy. So Hillard told her, "Don't worry about that. If you're physically concerned for your safety, you need to leave the apartment immediately." Gail took the advice, packed a few things, and drove out to her grandfather's 3-bedroom attached home in the Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn. The next day, she called the attorney back and told her that she was at her grandfather's place. Now, Hillard offered to put Gail in touch with the divorce attorney, but Gail said she was still in touch with Bob and was trying to rescue the relationship and try to make it work. And she added, "Especially now that I have a little leverage, I have the upper hand since he tried to strangle me." And she said she felt therapy would help. So she came up with a lot of reasons why she shouldn't leave Bob, and loving him wasn't one of those reasons. Listing Bob's faults, Gail said that he was unreasonably jealous, but didn't mention to her family that she was cheating on him, which kind of gave him a reason to be jealous.
One would think.
Yeah.
So Gail asked her sister Elaine to keep the information from their parents, at least for the moment. Gail did not tell Bob she was reporting him to the police. She called the police to find out what to do and was told to go to her local precinct to report the incident. So that Saturday, she walked into the 19th precinct and told the uniformed sergeant behind the counter inside why she was there and was directed to the complaint room. A civilian police aide took the information for a criminal complaint of assault, 3rd degree. The aide typed that Gail's husband did strangle her to the point of unconsciousness. Now, a police lieutenant signed the form, and the matter is referred to family court. So there's no investigation. Bob was not arrested.
So that seems strange to me.
It does. And we don't know what transpired, but, Gail was mainly wanting that event and the reporting to be used as something she could blackmail Bob with.
Well, at least he used it as having the upper hand, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I guess so, but it says that he strangled her to the point of unconsciousness. That seems like automatic arrest to me.
It would.
Yeah.
But we don't know the whole story necessarily, do we?
I guess not, but that seems weird to me.
Well, it seems weird to me that they didn't arrest him.
But you're right, she did want to use this event to force him to do something that he absolutely refused to do, which was to get psychiatric counseling. So he did agree. He called his sister, who was a psychiatrist. Her name was Michelle, and he asked her for help. Michelle sent Bob to a psychologist named Shelley Duran, who spoke to Bob several times on the phone and had one session with him in her Brooklyn office. After this session with Bob, during which she discussed with him his strong feelings about Gail, the therapist became quite alarmed, and she told Bob to go home and put Gail on the phone with her because she wanted to be reassured that Gail was okay. So Bob did call the therapist.
Whoa, wait a minute. She did what?
She told him to go home and put Gail on the phone so she could make sure Gail was still okay, alive and breathing.
So she must have some real deep misgivings.
Oh, absolutely.
About Bob.
Yes.
He's had to have said something to her that triggered that reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Which, to
I
me,
think he was fairly honest with her.
Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of extreme.
It's very extreme,
Right?
yes, of course.
I mean,
It's not normal.
no, that's not a normal course of action for a psychotherapist.
Nobody did it. He put Gail on the line, and Gail said, "Oh, yeah, I'm fine."
Yeah, now, while Bob's listening on the extension, Joanne warned Gail that Bob was a dangerous man, and she referred the couple to Dr. Stanley Bone. Dr. Bone met with Bob twice and also asked him for his permission to call Gail at home. So we got two psychotherapists that are worried enough about Bob that they want to make sure Gail's okay.
Yes.
This is getting weirder and
They
weirder.
definitely think he's dangerous.
So then Dr. Bone referred the couple to Dr. Michael Stone in Manhattan. So the other part of this is, besides these psychotherapists wanting Bob or wanting to hear from Gail that she was okay, neither of them wanted to treat the couple.
Well, Dr. Bone said he was booked, so I don't know if that's the
Right.
case. But that
Sure.
was the excuse he had. Dr. Stone was given information on Bob's past violent incidents, and he agreed to see him. So he arranged a separate 90-minute session for each of them, Bob and Gail, and Bob went first. Dr. Bone had told Dr. Stone that both of these new patients might have borderline personality disorder. The traits of borderline personality are intensity, an all-or-nothing type approach to life, aggression, manipulation. They can also be demanding, fickle, seductive, unreasonable, childish, and clingy. This is all according to Dr. Stone. Now, Dr. Stone was immediately struck by Bob as a really scary person. Bob described fighting in his marriage and said they hadn't had sex in 3 months. He told Dr. Stone about his attack on Gail's cat, explaining that he tried to kill it because it didn't listen to him. Also, Bob told Dr. Stone how he had choked his previous fiancée, Marcy, during an argument. This had caused her to call off their engagement. After Marcy kicked him out, he said that he used his key to the apartment while she was away, and he went inside and choked the cat to death then. The doctor knew that serial killers often start out killing animals. As Bob told him about these killings, he was quite calm. He seemed cold and pretty indifferent to the whole thing. Bob also spoke about his past drug use. He said that he had fought with his dad over drugs. And he said that once he felt like murdering a college roommate and actually considered buying a gun and going ahead and doing it. Dr. Stone determined that Bob was narcissistic and very insecure. He also didn't seem to feel like he had to follow society's rules. He was obviously very intelligent and could be superficially charming, but underneath, Dr. Stone thought he was devious, insincere, and egocentric. In Stone's opinion, Bob was not a borderline personality, but actually a psychopath who he said was incurable. Now, not all psychopaths are murderers, but they are disconnected from their emotions and other people's emotions. So what made Bob especially dangerous was that he wasn't in control of his impulses. So he concluded pretty early on that Gail was at high risk.
Now, Gail had an appointment with Stone the next day, and at that visit, Stone planned to warn her about Bob. Stone did not believe he could treat Bob, but he was afraid his life would be at risk if he rejected him. So at the appointment, Gail told Stone that she thought Bob's parents were in denial about who Bob really was, that being a pathological liar. When she told Stone about the night Bob choked her on the balcony, she said that she knew he would be angry about the cigarettes. It seemed like she only smoked anymore to provoke him. So Stone then asked Gail if she considered calling off the wedding after she caught Bob trying to kill her cat. Now, her reply was that a woman's place is by her husband's side.
I don't know if that was a little bit of a sarcastic comment. I'm not sure.
It was. Now, Stone had lost 2 previous patients who were murdered by abusive partners, and Gail's own personality put her more at risk than he initially thought. So Gail had 7 out of 9 symptoms that suggested borderline personality disorder. These are frenzied attempts to avoid imagined abandonment, history of unstable relationships, confusion of identity, impulsivity in sex, drugs and eating, suicidal behavior, feelings of constant emptiness, and periods of temper or sadness.
So that same afternoon, Dr. Stone met with Bob again, and he told him he was suffering from a serious condition that involved significant risk. He said he would need to speak with Bob's parents. Then he told Bob about 2 security conditions he would have to comply with if Dr. Stone agreed to treat him. He said that he would make 2 tapes of each session. One would go to Dr. Stone's attorney, and Bob would take the other one home. Then Bob's parents would have to pay to have Dr. Stone's life insured for $4 million with Lloyd's of London, $2 million each to his 2 sons if he was killed. Now, Dr. Stone had come up with these conditions as a way to reject Bob without actually rejecting him.
It's kind of clever.
It's kind of clever, but I'm not sure if it was the right thing to do.
Well, it wasn't.
Okay. It wasn't by accident that he was treating Bob as if he was Ted Bundy. Stone believed that if Bob was really serious about changing his behavior, he would agree to these conditions. If not, he would reject Stone. Either way, Stone was kind of off the hook.
Yeah, but Bob was pretty pissed off about all this. He felt like Gail had set him up, and he wouldn't discuss the plan with his parents, and he rejected the whole scenario. He stormed out of the office. Stone had Gail come in the next day and tried to warn her all over again. Gail's attitude and denial were deeply disturbing. Now, Stone became so concerned that he wrote a warning letter to her. Now, this is called a Tarasov letter, which is named after a Californian psychiatrist who was found at fault because he kept his patient's plan to murder confidential and didn't warn the woman who he killed. So this letter was drafted and ready for Gail's signature when she arrived.
Well, Gail wasn't only in denial. She didn't really feel alive unless she was taking risks. Sex and aggression were confused in her mind, like we touched on earlier. The pairing of Bob, this violent psychopath, and Gail, a self-destructive borderline personality, was just a setup for disaster, according to Dr. Stone. So Gail read the letter, and she refused to sign it. She took it home and actually showed it to Bob, and he was really happy that she hadn't signed it, saying that Dr. Stone was just really off the wall. Months later, they did go for a second opinion, and that psychiatrist didn't label Bob as a dangerous psychopath. He simply called them a dysfunctional couple. So they went to therapy for about 4 months, both individually and joint sessions, and it seemed to work for a while. They spent the holidays together, and Gail adopted 2 new cats. Like, she's just tempting things. I don't get that. But in April 1984, Gail met with the divorce attorney. She gave Bob a list of her demands, including $1,200 a month for 2 years, health insurance, and for Bob to pay her moving expenses and to pay off her student loans. Bob told Gail that he loved her and would do anything to keep her. So then they agreed to postpone the divorce if Bob treated her better. So she didn't go back to the divorce lawyer again. In May, Gail got her BA and entered grad school. She had affairs with at least 2 men who she had over to the apartment while Bob was at work. Bob and Gail continued to argue a lot, and neighbors could hear that. Bob told his friend, who'd been his best man at his wedding, that he was really angry with Gail. He said he hated her so much that he could kill her. Then he added that she was having affairs and hanging out with druggies.
On July 7th, 1985, neighbors heard Bob and Gail arguing. Not an uncommon occurrence.
No.
Gail was in a rage. She told Bob he was pathetic and told him all about her affairs. She wasn't holding back, so it's likely she brought up her evidence of Medicaid fraud, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I don't think it turned out to be real.
No, it's just an instrument.
But she kind of could exaggerate.
And she threatened to call the police if Bob didn't meet her demands. Now this downstairs neighbor heard wood furniture scraping on the floor, then a loud bang, which was followed by silence. About an hour later, a friend called Gail to ask why she and Bob hadn't come to her party that she'd had the night before. Bob answered the phone and said that Gail wasn't there. He said he'd have Gail call her back later. Now around 3:30, Bob left the apartment, carrying a large, heavy duffel bag to his car in the garage. He arrived at the Caldwell Airport in New Jersey before 4:30 and was logged in for a 4:30 to 6:30 slot for flying. He didn't have a flight plan. He did his usual pre-flight checks and radioed for clearance. As long as he avoided major airport areas, nobody would track his path. He flew over the Wanakee Reservoir, which was about 7 miles long and the longest in New Jersey, between 35 and 90 feet deep. It was deserted even on such a nice day because it supplied drinking water for the region. There's no fishing, swimming, or boating allowed. Bob returned to the airport at 6:25. He then drove to his sister Michelle's house, which was only about 5 miles away from the airport, in order to attend his nephew's birthday party. He didn't mention to anyone that he had flown that day. And after the party, he arrived home to his apartment in Manhattan around 11:30 that night. Gail wasn't there, so Bob phoned Gail's parents on Long Island.
Right, and Sylvia answered the phone. And Bob asked her if Gail was there, so she was worried right away by this. And Bob explained that they'd had a fight that morning and that Gail had walked out to cool off. Then Bob called 2 of Gail's girlfriends, too, and both hadn't seen her, and they were immediately concerned as well. Bob then called one of Gail's professors, and she told him that he had to call the police and report her missing. Sylvia, Gail's mom, couldn't sleep, and she called her daughter Elaine, who was in Virginia. She told her about Bob's call. Elaine knew the marriage was in trouble and told Sylvia that it wasn't too surprising Gail might have left and she'd be back because they were fighting a lot. But late that night around 1 a.m., the neighbor below Bob heard the furniture being moved, as if someone was cleaning or looking for something. Bob didn't call the police to report Gail missing. He had to work in the morning, so he just went to bed. In the morning, he drove to work, and he called Beth Israel Hospital, where Gail did her graduate work, but she hadn't shown up for work. He checked in again with her family and her friends, and he told one of her friends that he was afraid that she might harm herself, because she did have that history. Now, after work that night around 9 p.m., Bob drove to the police station and reported Gail missing. He said they'd had a fight and she'd walked out about 11 o'clock in the morning. So Central Park was searched, and Bob continued to work all week. But he heard from family and friends every day, asking about Gail. Gail's parents and sister came to their apartment, and they got really worried when they saw that Gail had left her purse, keys, and cigarettes behind. So that doesn't make any sense to do that. They didn't actually accuse Bob of anything, but they were definitely suspicious.
They were.
I mean, why would you leave without your purse? And if you're mad, the first thing you're going to do is grab a cigarette if you're a smoker.
One would think, right?
I would think so. But Bob said that the doorman had seen Gail leave the building on Sunday morning. Elaine then questioned the doorman, who said it was Saturday morning when he saw her. So this convinced her that Bob had done something to Gail. Why else would he lie? The Katz family pretended to help Bob look for Gail, but all the while they were looking for evidence that he had killed her. They were feeling pretty sure right away that that's what had happened.
Yeah, they looked to him quickly.
Yes. They did, but the police didn't necessarily. They took a while to act.
Right. Now, he'd been interviewed by the police later that week, so it wasn't even that much of a priority for them.
No.
He told the police about the doorman seeing Gail on Sunday, but no one, including the doorman, had seen Gail on Sunday. So by the time the police went over to get the apartment building's security footage, it had been erased and taped over. Bob was also interviewed by the local news. He seemed pretty unemotional, but said he was worried about his wife.
So Bob and his family, along with the Katz family, posted missing flyers everywhere between the apartment and Central Park, and then all over Manhattan. There were many reported sightings, but most went nowhere. A man, Joel Davis, contacted police and said he saw Gail alive in the company of another woman that Sunday at a bagel store around 3 p.m. So after a week, Bob was questioned more thoroughly. He admitted that they fought a lot. The detective tried to get Bob to commit to his story that the doorman had seen Gail on Sunday, but he didn't fall for it. He said he'd made a mistake and the doorman had actually seen her on Saturday, and he apologized for the mix-up. Gail's parents told police that Bob had choked Gail into unconsciousness about a year earlier, and they also told them about the cat incident. Gail had 2 boyfriends at the time she disappeared, and her sister told police about that. And the sister, Elaine, was really afraid that Bob had found out and killed Gail. Bob was the last person to see Gail, but he also had no arrest record. He was a surgeon, so they did wonder if he could have cut up her body and disposed of it somehow. So while the family went out with Bob to distribute the flyers, one of them stayed behind, I think it was the little brother, to answer the phone and check the apartment for anything suspicious. So they were actually looking in drains for blood or body parts or anything that would be suspicious like that. They didn't find anything. Bob and his father hired an attorney, and 2 weeks after Gail's disappearance, the police seemed focused on Bob instead of searching for Gail. So it became clear that the Katz family really felt that he had killed Gail. Bob explained his relationship with Gail to his attorney, and he went over with him in detail the weekend that Gail disappeared. He said that during his 2-hour flight, he didn't go anywhere of consequence. He just did some practice landings and takeoffs. He knew that he was already a suspect, and that was why he made the decision not to tell police about his flight that day.
That probably was a mistake.
Well, was it a mistake or was it on purpose? I think it was on purpose.
Well, yeah, but it was a mistake in that it made the police more suspicious of him.
Oh, if he just admitted to it? I don't know. I think if he'd admitted to it, he still would have been suspicious right away.
Yeah.
For flying that day.
Cops hate a person who omits things or lies about things.
But Bob also suggested that Gail may have been killed by drug dealers. But all she would have had on her, as far as drugs go, is just enough for her own personal use. And why would a drug dealer kill her and then take her body away somewhere? That didn't make sense. Now, if she had killed herself, she definitely would have been found somewhere. Bob's lawyer read the letter that was written by Dr. Stone, and it made Bob sound really dangerous. But due to patient-doctor confidentiality, the police weren't going to see that letter. So Gail's case went unsolved. Then in May 1989, so it's 4 years almost.
4 years after, yep.
A female torso was found washed up on Staten Island, and when these remains were examined, the coroner concluded that it was Gail's torso. So this was before DNA, but they did notice a deformity in one of the ribs that matched a corresponding rib in an old x-ray of Gail's chest. It appeared that the arms and legs had been surgically removed from the torso, so this made Gail's family feel for certain that Bob had killed her. As a surgeon, Bob would have had the skills to do that. But, of course, this wasn't enough to indict him.
Not even close. So the Katz family buried the torso, had a funeral. Gail was declared legally dead. Now, Elaine Katz never let up on Bob, spreading the word that Bob was a murderer. She sent letters to doctors, nurses, and office people who Bob worked with, telling them to ask Bob what happened to his wife. Now, in 1989, late in 1989, Bob moved to Las Vegas. He had switched from cardiothoracic surgery and ended up completing a residency in plastic surgery before he left New York. So he did become a successful plastic surgeon with his own practice in Nevada. But instead of specializing in cosmetic surgery, which would certainly be easy in a place like Las Vegas, right?
Right, yeah.
Bob worked with people with deformities and children with cleft lips and cleft palates. He even made trips at least once a year to a rural area in Mexico to help the kids and the adults down there.
And also while living in Vegas, Bob was really popular and dated a lot of women.
Well, sure.
Of course, he was dishonest with many of them, and more than one of them caught him cheating. But he did seem to have a social conscience. Like you said, he had joined the Flying Doctors of Mercy and became part of a group of physicians who went down to Mexico at least 4 times a year, and there they used donated supplies and paid their own way so they could provide free treatment and surgery to indigent patients. Maybe he did this because of a guilty conscience, I don't know. But some of these patients he saw had never even been seen by a doctor, and because he spoke fluent Spanish, he was able to communicate with the children and the parents. And, repairing a cleft lip palate changes the lives of the children there.
Well, it does.
Yeah, a large part of the population believed that deformities in a child meant that the child was inhabited by the devil, so they could be ostracized.
But the surgeries could correct them and make the child be included more in the group.
Exactly.
So, win-win.
So it was a good thing to do.
It was. And he did this.
He did this. He didn't have to.
Willingly.
Right.
And from what we've read, he actually enjoyed doing it, looked forward to doing it.
I think so. So I don't know if he was just a good person in some ways. I don't know. I mean, that's a whole debate, but he did do it.
So Bob ended up marrying a gynecologist named Janet in 1995, and he moved with her to Minot, North Dakota. That's quite a change from Las Vegas, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he started a new practice in Minot. He liked it there. It was cold in the winter, but there was very little crime and lots of wide open spaces. And insurances weren't as much of a hassle as they were in Las Vegas, so he could bill patients and get paid more. So it was good for him.
Well, and the wife, because she
Financially.
was a doctor as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So Bob and Janet bought a luxury condo. He joined the Rotary Club, and all the time he continued to fly airplanes. He impressed a lot of people with his intelligence and skills. He was an excellent guitarist, in addition to being an excellent surgeon. And he even made his own fresh bagels, giving them to friends. Most of his patients loved him, and they called him Dr. Bob.
Well, the marriage seemed quite happy. If he ever did or said anything insensitive to Janet, he sent her flowers the next day. But his new friends would learn that Bob was very opinionated, and he never did anything that he didn't want to do. If people didn't follow his instructions, he could really blow up and scream at them. He even fired several of his patients who failed to quit smoking or went back to smoking after their surgery. Quitting was for their own good, he thought, so why would he tolerate their failure to take care of themselves and be their doctor? They were just out of the practice. Find another doctor.
Yep, there's no middle ground with Bob.
But then once he was in North Dakota, he did do cosmetic surgeries. He did breast enhancement surgeries. He also did breast reductions for women with the painfully heavy breasts. But he also reconstructed breasts for women who had undergone mastectomy due to breast cancer. And he still worked at the hospital emergency room, performing emergency operations like hand reconstruction. I just don't know where he would find all the time to do all this stuff.
No kidding.
It amazes me.
This guy's a dynamo.
I don't know how you can do that many things. But Janet, on the other hand, was really becoming disillusioned with medicine. She was an overachiever like Bob, so she enrolled in law school to try something new. Now, to help her accomplish that goal, they moved 400 miles away to Grand Forks, which was a larger town, and in her spare time, she worked on writing a novel. As she would finish a chapter, which featured a female gynecologist as the main character, Bob would edit it, copy it, and then he'd show it to his coworkers to get their opinions on it. He seemed really proud of her work, but a lot of these coworkers were shocked by the content in these chapters. It was a satirical novel that centered on female masturbation and a male plot to keep them from reaching their masturbatory potential. It was supposed to be funny, but it offended many people because it was so graphic and over the top. Bob and Janet had a daughter in 1998 that they named Anna, and Bob was the one who examined his daughter after she was born. He was so happy he cried, and after they took her home, Bob was the one who took care of her 24 hours a day while Janet was studying for her law school finals. Bob told Janet he'd be happy to give up his career and be a full-time dad, but he was the only one with a paying job, so he needed to get back to work. So they needed to hire a nanny.
Right, but they went through a series of nannies. Now, several of the nannies felt that the couple were perfectionists who hovered over them. But eventually they hired a day nanny to be home while they worked and a night nanny to care for Anna when she woke at night. So in the summer of 1998, Gail's torso was exhumed for DNA testing, and the mitochondrial DNA did not match the Katz family members' DNA samples. So the torso wasn't Gail's. So it wasn't returned to a burial site, which remained empty. So this is a big shock. You found this torso, you've been told by authorities that it's Gail, and you bury it with services and everything's fine, and now you find out,
I don't know if everything's fine. Nothing was ever fine.
Well, it's fine in the sense that there's a small amount of closure. They found her body, and it was buried. But it wasn't her body.
No, and I think some of them were skeptical that it was her even before that.
Yeah,
that's why when DNA testing became available, they did it.
Well, and the way it's written up in the book, there's no question from the beginning that it wasn't Gail's body, torso. There
was a time period issue.
Time period issue in terms of it shouldn't have been as well preserved as it was if it had been in the water all that time. But also the torso had evidence of surgery, or at least something that split her sternum, which Gail never had.
That's true.
So it wasn't Gail.
So I don't know why they jumped to that conclusion.
Well, because they wanted to put an end to it.
I guess, but that's pretty shaky. Anyway, her murder case was reopened with a new young investigator on the team. They flew to Las Vegas and to Minot to question those who knew him, but they didn't hear anything about a confession or any violent behavior on his part. So one prominent detail stood out to the lead investigators, though. that Robert Bierenbaum had logged flight hours over the Atlantic Ocean on the day that Gail disappeared, but failed to notify police of this during their initial investigation. Now, they figured this out by getting plane rental records from the airport, and they were able to present documentation that Bob did fly on July 7, 1985. In his own logbook, Bob had written down that he flew on 8/7/85, but the 7 had been changed to an 8, and it was obvious because he'd used a different color ink.
Yeah.
So you could look at that either ways, like, well, if he was trying to hide it, why wouldn't he use the same color ink? That would have been really stupid for such a smart guy. So it's hard to tell, although I think I lean towards the fact that he changed it and he just used the wrong ink.
Right. I think so.
Because even brilliant people can make stupid mistakes.
They can.
Sure.
So with the inquiry into Gail's disappearance elevated from a missing persons case to a homicide case, interviews with family, friends, and even Bob and Gail's psychiatrist became more significant. Then in December of 1999, Bob was indicted. Now, guilty or innocent, the arrest would ruin his career.
Sure it would. Who's going to let someone operate on them that was arrested for murder?
Not too many.
No. So as Bob prepared to fly back to New York, he was, of course, under FBI surveillance. And Janet flew back with him, or flew back after him to be with him, and he was able to get bail, which was set at $1 million. But they confiscated his passport and his pilot's license, and he was ordered to stay in his parents' home in New Jersey. Bob's lawyer told reporters that the prosecution had no evidence that Bob was involved in Gail's disappearance. They couldn't even prove that Gail was dead. But Elaine, Gail's sister, was convinced that he was guilty and that he would be convicted. Bob was vilified in the media around the country as a cat-killing, wife-choking murderer.
Yeah, I like that. Stories in the New York Post, which was never known for its conservative, laid-back views.
That's a bit of a tabloid.
Right. Portrayed him as a mild-mannered doctor by day and a killer by night.
Sure.
But the elimination of the torso as Gail's meant that there was no longer a valid death certificate. And when Bob's lawyer received the prosecution's response to his demand for the bill of particulars, there was very little there. So Bob's lawyer filed a motion to have the indictment dismissed because there just wasn't enough proof that Gail had been murdered. Now this motion was denied.
So I think that Bob's lawyer was really shocked by this. This isn't normally the amount of stuff you're going to go ahead with an indictment on.
Yeah, I think he's a little shocked at sort of they're changing the rules of how things work.
They kind of did, yeah. The prosecution revealed that they had Dr. Michael Stone's letter to Gail, which had warned her that she might suffer personal injury or death at her husband's hands. They also introduced the records from the airport that recorded Bob's flight and the amount of time he spent in the air. So Bob faced 25 years to life for murder, but the prosecution offered him a 5 to 15-year plea agreement, which he turned down.
Right, and then in another case in March, people were convicted of murder without a body being present. So this didn't bode well for Bob, or potentially didn't bode well for Bob, because there's a precedent now. You don't need a body.
So this was Sante and Kenneth Kimes. This is a case we've learned about. I think someone recommended it. It was a mother-son. So it was in June 1998 that with her son Kenneth, Sante Kimes ran a scheme where she assumed the identity of their landlady, who was an 82-year-old socialite, Irene Silverman, and then they wanted to take ownership of her $7.7 million Manhattan mansion. So the search for Mrs. Silverman went as far as Mount Olive, New Jersey. Paperwork and tax records were found in the Kimes' possession, and search of the acreage revealed nothing. Without the Kimes' cooperation, there was the assumption that she could be buried there and that the Kimes were really familiar with the property. Despite the fact that Silverman's body was never found, both mother and son were convicted of murder in 2000. And that was mostly because of the discovery of their notebooks that detailed the crime and the written notes by Irene Silverman, who was extremely suspicious of them. So Kenneth Kimes confessed that his mother had used a stun gun on Irene Silverman, and he had strangled her, stuffed her corpse into a bag, and deposited it in a dumpster in Hoboken, New Jersey. So you can see it's pretty similar, although it seems like they had more evidence than they do with Bob here.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But the basic thing is that Turns out you don't have to have a body to charge someone.
Which is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
So in July, the presiding judge in the case issued a written opinion that she would allow the prosecution wide latitude at trial. Now, that's not something a defense attorney or defendant wants to hear. Those are scary words. Yeah.
Yes.
She ruled that hearsay evidence would be allowed because it was a domestic violence situation, and the DA would also be allowed to present evidence about Bob choking Gail in 1983 and about Gail's plans to leave Bob. She would hold a hearing where Dr. Stone would testify, and she would decide if he would appear before the jury. So this is really bad news for Bob. The only good news was that she probably would not allow Bob's alleged cat attacks to be admitted at the trial.
Small victory.
Yeah, not even a full victory, really.
No. So Janet, though, she had to return to her work because there's nobody earning any money in this family.
Right.
So she went back to work as a gynecologist. She visited Bob at his parents' house in New Jersey and brought their daughter along, so they were able to see each other.
She stood by him.
She did. Now, Bob, for his part, was convinced he'd never be convicted. At the hearing with the psychiatrist, Dr. Stone, the prosecution said that Bob had waived his right to confidentiality when he agreed to let Dr. Stone talk to his parents, and he wasn't a patient because they had only met in consultation. Now, that second part is very much hair-splitting.
Yeah, for sure.
Bob's lawyer argued that he had not waived confidentiality, though it doesn't matter. When you start from the very beginning, doctor-patient relationship trumps everything.
That's what you would think.
Right. Now, the defense claimed that Dr. Stone was in violation of the ethics of his profession because he had discussed Gail and Bob with the press.
So that's kind of a separate issue, but yeah, I do have a problem with that.
Yes. 2 psychiatric associations agreed and called for the state to investigate Stone for ethics violations, but the judge ruled for the prosecution. So the judge is pretty much handing things to the prosecution.
It kind of seems that way, doesn't it?
It does.
So when the trial opened on October 2nd, 2000, the press was focused on how the prosecutors would solve the problem of the missing body. Basically, the law demands that the prosecution of any crime must pass the corpus delicti test, which refers to the body of the crime, not a human corpse, proving that the crime actually took place. Normally, the prosecution does base a murder case on a dead body or on other physical evidence, but legal history does have murder convictions won by prosecutors who built the body of the crime without any physical evidence, demonstrating that a crime had taken place just by circumstantial evidence. There are obstacles to such a presentation, and the prosecution built that argument in the Bierenbaum case. So without any trace of her corpse, prosecutors had to prove that there had been no sign of Gail Bierenbaum's existence since the date of her disappearance. And I think that was the big thing here.
Well, yeah. And this is 15 years after the event. And in those 15 years, there's absolutely no trace of Gail.
That's the big thing, I think, yes.
So there's no activity in her bank, her credit card, Social Security accounts. Nobody's seen her, except for that one eyewitness who claimed he saw her on the day she disappeared.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
We will.
Prosecutors also had to present a theory under which the murder could have happened and explain what the defendant's motive might have been. So they claimed that on the weekend of her disappearance, she intended to tell Bob that she was leaving permanently for another man. They claimed that Bob had strangled her after she told him she was ending their marriage, saying he then placed her body in a duffel bag and put it in the trunk of his father's Cadillac. Next, he drove to the Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, where he rented a plane, flew out low over the ocean, and disposed of her body.
So when police had done a reenactment to prove that it was possible for this to happen, they had videotaped a reenactment, showed it to the jury, demonstrating how a bag or bags could be dumped from an airplane that was identical to the one Bob had flown. Without any other help, a single person could do it.
I don't find it hard to believe that he could. Sure.
No.
Especially if you're flying low.
They also showed that Bob had lied repeatedly and had given conflicting versions of events. The most damning lie was a lie of omission, that he had never told the police about a 2-hour flight on the day his wife disappeared, and then had attempted, apparently, to cover up the flight by altering his flight log. We also have 3 psychiatrists warning Gail that her husband was possibly homicidal.
I don't even think possibly. I think they were pretty sure he was homicidal.
Right, but the judge ruled that they could not testify because of patient confidentiality. Now, the judge said she was distressed that she had to exclude testimony of the 3 psychiatrists who were impressed by the danger posed by the defendant, but that she had to balance that against the protections ordered by the law to patient-doctor relationships.
So at least they gave the defense that, because at first she wasn't going to.
It still didn't work for the defense. It's kind of a sop.
Well, sure.
A little tidbit you're tossing to them.
Right. Well, the whole defense strategy was just based on discrediting the prosecution's case. That's really all they had. They didn't want to risk putting Bob on the stand to testify in his own defense. And they claimed the prosecution's case was based just on guesswork and supposition, which I can kind of see that. There were no eyewitnesses and no physical evidence. And Gail's disappearance with no trace could have been, I don't know, from many things, right? I guess it suggested she was dead.
It certainly does.
But no one can possibly know or prove that she died or how she died.
Right. And the defense also pointed to Gail's risky behavior, including her love affairs with drug dealers or drug users. Under the defense's theory of the case, Gail's many threats to leave her husband suggested she might have done so and then met with foul play.
So that's a possibility, isn't it?
Slim.
Yeah, I kind of feel like if she left him and then met with foul play, someone would have killed her in the park and her body would have been found there. Why would someone take her away? That's the suspicious part.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
I think 15 years is an awful long time to have absolutely no sightings or information about her.
Right.
So.
But still, is it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Well, I think it is.
Do you?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I do. I think he did it, but I'm not sure that they proved he did it. They have no evidence of blood.
No, but if you're applying the doctrine of beyond reasonable doubt, he did it, and he's found guilty.
So you don't think it's a reasonable doubt that she could have left?
No. Not after 15 years and no sightings. Now, maybe arbitrarily pick a number. Say it was a year later, and nobody had seen her. I think that's too soon to say anything about that. But 15 years with absolutely nothing? No. She's dead.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, he could have lied about the flight thing just because he knew it would look suspicious. We did say that.
Yeah, and?
So they're saying that shows he was guilty, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it shows that he was worried about looking guilty. I'm just being devil's advocate here to give the other side.
I just don't understand that.
You don't understand that other side at all?
No.
So you're pretty much on board with what they did here?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me, am I 100% certain he did it? No. But I'm pretty convinced he did it.
And you don't have to be 100%. You just have to be beyond a reasonable doubt.
I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt
Okay.
that the only scenario that explains things is that he killed her and disposed of her body.
Because they, of course, they did the whole interviewing and following and making sure that her boyfriends couldn't have done it. So we know that neither of them could have done it. Okay, so what about the only defense witness? They only had one witness.
Yeah, this is a guy who testified that he had seen Gail at a bagel shop in 1985 on the day that the prosecution claimed she had been murdered. He described Gail as a statuesque, buxom woman. The reality was that Gail was 5'3", 110 pounds, and pretty flat-chested. So he was forced to admit, the witness, Joel Davis, was forced to admit that he had actually described a totally different person.
So he's pretty much
so his testimony
no
is
good,
destroyed.
just thrown out, yeah. So yeah, what do you think about them only calling one witness?
Well, I think that's probably a good tactic, because the more you try to explain what could have happened, the more trouble you're going to get into.
So they're kind of sending the message to the jury, this is ridiculous.
Right.
I'm not even going to spend all day.
I don't have to spend all my time
Right.
and effort interviewing or deposing or questioning a bunch of people, because I don't need to.
Because the prosecution failed to prove their case, which
Right.
we've seen that in many trials.
Yes.
But it didn't work for this one.
No. After 2 weeks of testimony and just 2 days of deliberation, The jury found Bob guilty of second-degree murder. So state sentencing rules called for a minimum sentence of 15 years to life and a maximum of 25 years to life. Now, on November 30th, 2000, the presiding judge, Judge Snyder, sentenced Bierenbaum to 20 years to life. It's kind of like she took something in the middle. 15 to life is too short, 25 to life is too long. I'll give him 20 to life.
I'm okay with that sentence, assuming that they did prove he did it.
If we found him guilty, yeah. Now, he's lost his appeals, but he's up for parole in 2020. We'll see what happens with that.
So I guess the thing about him is, let's put aside the psychopath, the anger, the violence, the animal killing, which is all super horrible, totally bad. I'm not saying anything is okay about that.
Okay.
But this guy did some good works. This was a brilliant man who had a lot to offer society and did give a lot to society.
That he did.
So
now, couldn't you say he did that in an attempt to atone?
That's what people have said, and that's possible.
I'd look at it that way.
So, of course, he's a murderer.
Well,
but is he a completely evil person?
You say, of course, he's a murderer. You say he's most likely a murderer.
Okay. He's most likely a murderer.
Yeah.
He is thought to be a murderer. He is proved guilty of murder. All right? He's a convicted murderer.
He's convicted of murder.
But he helped a lot of people.
That he did.
So are we going to judge him on the worst thing he did in his life, even though he did a lot of good things?
Of course we are. I mean, how else are you going to do that?
I'm just thinking, I don't want to be judged on the worst thing I ever did, or I'd just be like a douchebag idiot.
Well, but that's how it happens. That's how it works.
Yeah.
So you can do your whole life being a saint.
Right.
But you did that one horrible thing.
Right.
And that's how you're judged.
Just sad.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's realistic.
It's not that way on TV, though.
Well,
on TV, people redeem themselves all the time from horrible things. Don't they?
Well, they attempt to.
But they kind of seem to. Like, people can become heroes after being murderers on TV.
Yeah, they
but
can.
In real life, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't.
No. Which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just hope that someone that has these talents and this intelligence can at least do something constructive in prison. Like you said, if he was doing this to make up for the bad thing he did, I hope that he was able to continue that, and not for his benefit, but for society's benefit.
Sure.
Okay.
But he couldn't. He surrendered his license to practice medicine.
Well, he couldn't practice medicine.
He's not going to do any medicine work in prison.
Maybe he could advise people on not smoking in prison. He could have a smoking cessation class in prison.
Come on.
Oh, seriously, he could. A lot of people do things in prison.
Yeah.
Right? That are constructive.
Right.
Within the prison.
He doesn't sound to me like he'd be successful as a smoking counselor.
No, and
no middle ground.
He looks kind of scary. And that picture of him, I think it was in 2010, I saw a picture of him. He looks creepy. He does not look good. He did not age well.
No, he hasn't.
No, because he was almost kind of cute in his 20s, and he just turned out really bad looking. So if you want more on this case, which there is a lot more, there is a book that's very detailed. It's called The Surgeon's Wife by Kieran Crowley.
Good book.
Yeah. There are also some documentaries. We've got Dominic Dunn's Power, Privilege, and Justice, which is a really good show. I don't know how many episodes. There might have only been one season, but I like the show. And the episode that was about this case is called Doctor of Deceit. We also have an episode of The Devil You Know called The Perfect Husband. And a really good documentary I really enjoyed a lot was Intimations of Murder, and that was a Vanity Fair Confidential episode. If you're intrigued by stories of injustice, you'll love the new series Wrong Man. Wrong Man is a new Starz docuseries from the Emmy-winning filmmaker of Paradise Lost, and it follows the stories of 3 inmates claiming their innocence, as well as a team of experts who reopen their case to find the truth. Watch Wrong Man premiering June 3rd at 9 p.m. only on Starz. You can get the Starz app and start a free trial today. Before we move into feedback, I'd just like to thank our listeners, our Tie Grabber members, our Patreon supporters, and all of you who send us your feedback and your suggestions. We've really had an abundance of intelligent, really thoughtful feedback, don't you think?
We have.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. And also the suggestions are really good. A bit disturbing, though, to me that there are so many crimes out there to cover. I don't know if I'll ever get over that.
Well, we'll never run out of cases to discuss, will we?
No, but remember when we started doing this, we thought, well, we're going to run out of interesting cases in a year or two. This is just going to be a little thing.
Well, now it looks like for every case we present, there's probably 5 more that we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, you're right.
We ain't ever going to run out.
No, which is kind of sad. If you'd like to add some small support for the podcast, and if you'd like an extra episode to listen to once in a while, you can support the podcast by joining Team Tie Grabber at tiegrabber.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/True Crime Brewery. As a member, you'll get access to our 20 current members-only TCB episodes and the new ones that we release every month. There's some pretty good episodes. I was looking through the feed the other day and kind of cleaning things up, and we really have some good ones in there. Like, remember our 4-parter on O.J. Simpson?
Oh, yeah. How can I forget?
And the Tina Watson, one of my favorites, is the Tina Watson case. She was the young woman who died scuba diving on her honeymoon. And in that episode, we have a really fascinating interview with the scuba diving expert who was involved in the U.S. trial against Tina's husband.
Yeah, that was a fantastic interview.
I mean, he just kind of took over the show.
He did.
He was fascinating.
Yeah, he had my attention the entire time.
He did, because we don't know anything about scuba diving. We really needed him. We couldn't cover the case without him, the way I looked at it.
Oh, he was excellent.
Yeah. So that's that's worth membership to me right there, just to hear that one.
Right.
Yeah. And what else? We also have Diane Downs, Philip Markoff, Bart Whitaker. He's the one that pretended to be graduating college and had his friend go in and kill the whole family. I mean, we've got all kinds of psychos in there.
We do.
In addition, when you offer support to us, we're going to send along a bottle opener or a snifter. That's Dick's favorite beer drinking glass. And I also throw in a few more pieces of TCB swag like stickers, magnets, coasters. We've got these cute new little magnets that are little beer glasses that are adorable. And just remember, when you join, it can take a few minutes to get your login information in an email. And if you don't see it after a while, check your junk folder. Sometimes the software, the way it goes, will have that email end up in your junk mail, and you can retrieve it there. Now, of course, there are other important ways you can offer us some support. You can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. You can also participate in our Facebook group, True Crime Brewery Fan Discussions. And also, if you are able to take a few minutes and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, that really helps us out a lot. Okay, Dick, why don't you start the feedback?
Okay, we have a voicemail first. And this is from Jessica, and it's about the dog mauling episode.
Okay, let's listen to that first.
Hello, Dick and Jill. This is just me providing you with some voicemail because I understand that you enjoy those. I have to say, I'm not surprised that a verdict of second-degree murder was held up in the case of Diane Whipple. Diane Whipple was exactly the kind of person a leader of the Aryan Nation would hate, since she was both an out lesbian and a woman living and supporting herself on her own with no influence from a man. And Noel and Noller were so incestuously obsessed with their supposed son, I have no doubt they would tell him about the people living in their apartment complex and take to heart what he would say in response. After all, they had already had prior contact with Whipple when Bain injured her wrist. I also have to express some sympathy for Bain and Hera, the dogs themselves. A constantly aggressive and unhappy dog is constantly upset and insecure, and I sincerely doubt that Noel and Noller did anything to help Bain and Hera acclimate to their new living situation, and in the end Bain and Hera were punished with death. I wish that they had arraigned Noel and Noller on animal cruelty charges as well, in addition to second-degree murder.
Kind of cut her off there, but I think the gist is there. The Aryan Brotherhood would not like Whipple.
So what do you mean? You mean that they meant to do it then?
I think there's a possibility that it was going to happen that way.
Well, what Jessica's saying gives us a whole new view of this case because it's very menacing, the way that she's explaining it. I considered that they were rude and that they didn't care that their dogs hurt people, but this is very menacing, like almost like it was a hate crime, and they may have enjoyed seeing their dog intimidate someone like Diane, and they may have wanted to actually brag to the prisoner about it.
I think there's a possibility that, not that the prisoner told the people, the lawyers that had the dogs, to sick them on Whipple, but I think it might have been implied that she'd be better off dead.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, now I might be wandering a little, but the more I look at the case and the circumstances, the more that it might have happened that way in my mind.
Okay. I have a case suggestion from Carrie L. I thought you would be interested in this story I found on MSN. Unsolved murder case haunts small Texas town 16 years later. Jennifer Harris was 28 when she disappeared on May 12, 2002. Her Jeep was found abandoned on the side of the road. 6 days later, a fisherman found her nude body floating in the river. Police learned Jennifer had told at least one other person she was pregnant. Initially, while she was missing, police reached out to the two men in her life, James Hamilton, her ex-boyfriend, and Rob Holman, her ex-husband. Both denied seeing her the night she disappeared. Both have denied being involved in the murder, and neither has been arrested or charged with any crime related to her murder. The case grew cold and along the way became part of the Bonham folklore and its rumor mill. In 2017, then newly elected Fannin County Sheriff Mark Johnson made good on a campaign promise to take a second look at Jennifer Harris's case. What he found was limited information and some evidence that had been damaged and destroyed by water getting into a storage pod. Johnson says he believes other evidence may have been mishandled. Darrell Parker, a former sheriff's lieutenant and Marine, is now a private investigator working with Harris's family to find answers. If anything happens in this case, rain or shine, any time of day, I'm on it, Parker said. Also trying to solve the case is Barry Wernick, a filmmaker married to Harris's sister, Alyssa. He began working on the project 2 years ago, and he says he's done interviews with people who were not interviewed by law enforcement early on, and he's following up on any leads he gets there.
Okay, so the case is open, or reopened, and
Yeah.
nothing much has happened yet.
No, but I think this was covered quite recently on 48 Hours, so if anyone's interested, there is a recent episode on that. And the filmmaker who's married to her sister, plus her sister, of course, they really seem to think that it was her ex-husband who's responsible.
Well, that's who you point to anyway, right?
Well, you got the boyfriend, too, the
ex-husband,
ex-boyfriend.
ex-boyfriend.
Right, one of them.
One of them would do it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I think that would be something we might cover one day, especially if anything new comes up with it.
Yeah, that'd be something to follow.
Yeah.
So I have just a quickie note from Joyce about the beer I did last time before. One of the most recent beers I had, called Softly Spoken Magic Spell from Single Cut Brewers.
During the episode I said, I know that comes from a song.
And you were right. So the whole thing is home, home again. I like to be here when I can. And when I come home cold and tired, it's good to warm my bones beside the fire. Far away across the field, the tolling of the iron bell calls the faithful to their knees to hear the softly spoken magic spells. Thank you, Joyce.
Yeah, Joyce got it. So Marcus wrote in with a comment on Mary Beth Tinning, which I think is a really recent one that we did just last week, right? So Marcus says, "Hi guys, thank you for covering the deaths of the Tinning children. It is easy to hate Mary Beth Tinning, and I do, but let's not overlook how she was allowed to continue. This case is an extreme in an almost common trend of child and partner abuse where someone ends up dead after repeated warning signs are seen and ignored. That obstetrician who refused to care for Mary Beth anymore but didn't report her is a complete douche. For lack of a better word, this seems fitting. Did any professionals speak to Jo? How about telling her not to get pregnant again for health reasons or any excuse that would work? Another noteworthy failure is the child services agencies who did not take custody of the new babies after several had died, who gave her an adopted child, Michael, who also was murdered, and who allowed her to be a foster parent. She easily could have murdered one of those foster children. Any child who came into contact with this woman and survived was damn lucky. No one kept them safe. Another point, why wasn't she prosecuted for the attempted murder of Jo, her husband? You don't need the victim to press charges. There were witnesses, Jo's brother and his wife Carol, who could testify to the bitter food and the missing phenobarb. It's easy to hate Jo, and I do, but he was a battered partner with his own psychological issues. All of this supports my belief that potential parents need to have psychological testing and acquire a license before becoming pregnant or adopting a child. So heartbreaking and anger-inducing. Arr.
Marcus, you covered things quite well.
I love Marcus.
So just as he's talked about things, yeah, I mean, the OB who doesn't care for her anymore because he suspected her of killing.
What a cop-out, really, if you think about it.
It is a huge cop-out.
I agree.
Now, if he truly believed that, he needs to call the authorities.
Yeah, he needs to make a big deal out of it.
He can't just go around saying, well, I knew she was a murderer.
Yeah.
Big fucking deal.
He is a douchebag, Marcus. You're right. And what about Joe? I mean, Marcus says, why wasn't she prosecuted for the attempted murder of Joe? Why wasn't Joe prosecuted for neglecting his children? He had to know something.
He should have.
Yeah. And it all comes back to if you see something, say something. Sounds cliche, but there's so much of this in these crimes, and especially in that one, that just kept happening again and again.
Yeah, and I get tired of hearing the same old story about, well, it happened in different jurisdictions and they don't talk to each other or share information.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I hopefully a lot of that's been corrected now that we have more centralized computer systems on things.
One would hope.
But I still think as far as family members, neighbors, people who come into contact, they don't say anything.
No, they don't.
They think, well, that's their business, I guess. But when you have someone, especially a child or someone who can't defend themselves, you really need to. I feel like it's your responsibility.
That it is.
Yeah. And I mean, especially with this obstetrician, it's totally his responsibility. He's a doctor. Did they have that rule back then?
No.
When did that mandatory reporting come into being? Recently?
20, 30 years ago.
Oh, okay.
This is 40 years ago.
Right. Just a little while after that.
Yeah, but still. It's just a bunch of self-serving bullshit to say, well, I thought she had murdered her kids, but I never did anything about it. Give me a break.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what about that Dr. Mealy, the one who defended her? Was he just thinking too positively of her?
I think he was letting his emotions lead instead of his brain.
He wasn't using the scientific method of thought.
Right. I mean, he obviously thought she was a good mother and never would have considered the fact that she could have harmed her kids. So he's coming at it from that angle.
Yeah, but I think if he'd done any reading...
Well,
and
yeah,
granted,
I mean, that's another thing. But
I mean, if he'd done any read any scientific research on this type of thing, it did exist. It was a while ago, but it did exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he could have figured out that the likelihood of these events being accidental are pretty slim to none.
Sure, but you know what? He sent those kids to Boston Children's and what was it, Albany, a big medical center in Albany?
Mm-hmm.
Those doctors didn't do anything either.
Nope.
And you know, when I think about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, which is an over-publicized case, sure, but I mean, we have to look at it, it's a very recent case where a lot of doctors didn't say anything about that either, even though they knew.
Well, that's a little different, only in the sense that it was a single case and not a whole pattern of cases.
Yeah, I know, but still, it's similar.
A little bit.
Yeah. It's similar in that nobody did anything.
And the final point from Marcus, I love his comment, his belief that potential parents need to have testing and get a license before they become parents.
Yeah, why not?
Well, I mean, if you talk about it in the abstract, yeah, it's a great idea. But then you get into eugenics and all that horrible stuff, so I'll leave that. But yeah, there's a lot of times I've thought when I'm seeing a child that, holy shit, these people shouldn't be parents.
And that's heartbreaking.
It is.
But I mean, I see what you're saying. We could really go off the deep end with that discussion, so let's not. But
I'm not going there.
But, you know, I totally get where you're coming from, Marcus. I see what he's saying.
Definitely do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up for today.
It's a wrap.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. And we will be here waiting for you next week with another case at the quiet end.
We'll be down at the quiet end. We'll be sitting next to the owl. He's a good drinking buddy.
He is, that's for sure.
Yeah, just got to watch his claws.
All right, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.